Hello, dear conference participants. My report called The Connection Between Esotericism and Science, or How the Second Parasitizes the First. Since science is a reproducible quantum entanglement of the real trajectory and trajectory of thinking. Let's start. It's very common to hear naive arguments between scientists and people associated with esotericism. The former claim the weakness and unpredictability of esotericism, while the latter speak of the limitations and ridiculousness of science. As always, the truth is in the middle, or in the language of quantum mechanics, in the superposition of these judgments. Both describe different parts of the elephant from the parable of the blind sages who try to feel the animal and describe their feelings. The word parasitic used in the title of the article is in quotation marks for the reason that this word has no objective basis. Parasitism is always mutual, and the process described by these words is actually symbiosis. It's possible to talk about in what proportion and what benefits each participant receives from the symbiosis. However, it is necessary to take into account that the situation is very dynamic, and in different periods of time, this ratio may differ significantly. This pattern is analogous to superposition of states in quantum mechanics, when as a result of measurement, the system is found is one of the basis states. For example, you are used. Two basis states. And this picture change over time. In the book Topology of Social, I show that symbolic forms, even in the form of raw ideas, are born in the field of poetry, then evolve in science, and finally freeze in philosophy. This idea of the evolution of symbolic forms is very important. I would be happy if someone could help me translate this book. You can see on the screen, and publish it abroad, maybe. Also, poetry as a field of knowledge that reveals new symbolic forms, metaphors, and esotericism are similar epistemological fields. Thus, esotericism generates ideas, each of which has its own reserve of cognition. But according to the principle of Occam's razor, only a part of them survives. The rest are not wrong, rather they are not effective in describing this moment and place of reality. And at the moment of the crisis of regular science, its development stops, and a point of bifurcation of the symbolic forms appears, and this in turn leads to scientific revolutions. The key characteristic of science is its predictivity. In other words, the correlation between expectation and reality. Do you know? A striking example of such prognostication was, for example, Edmund Halley's prediction of the next arrival of the comet named after him in 1758. When the calculation was almost justified, it was one of the triumphant proofs of the effectiveness of science. The word almost is very important in this context because its understanding forms the demarcation line between science and esotericism. In order to accept the existence of a fact, it is necessary that it be repeated a certain number of times. Physicists say they need 5 sigma, you know, or a confidence level of 99.9999%. This discovered motion of Halley's comet is one of the verification of Descartes' principle or the cyclical nature of all natural processes. To be more precise, the trajectory of arbitrary motion may not be closed, which is also the case with the comet, since it also moves at least around the center of the galaxy. The basis mathematical principles of mechanics, the Poincaré return time, and Liouville's theorem speak about the limitation of the phase volume and the mandatory return of the system to the vicinity of the initial position. You can see on the picture principle Poincaré return time and Liouville theorem. For what follows, we need to introduce a few concepts, and the first of them will be the trajectory of thinking in the semantic space, the space of meanings. The trajectory of thinking is no better or worse than the trajectory of a comet. It is also cyclical and can also return to its original position after some time. Moreover, this is what happens for the most part. Since thinking is also a multi-level process, closure occurs after a certain number of cycles at all levels. In the case of the brain, at least formally, Liouville's theorem on the limitation of phase space is fulfilled due to the obvious limitation of the size of the head. For us, the cyclical trajectory means its wave behavior, since any wave is characterized by its own frequency, which is the inverse of the repetition period of the process. Let us recall Lacan's 3 basis concepts, or 3 registers of thought. He introduced the concepts of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. If we use the terminology of quantum mechanics again, then we can assume that any person thinking is in a superposition of this register. The esotericist has a greater projection on the register of the imaginary, whereas the scientist from regular science uses the register of the symbolic more. Therefore, at the moment of the bifurcation of the trajectory of thinking, the crisis of the science, esotericism is more involved. let's try to formulate the main idea of this work so that it is clear what we will combine and with what. It consists in the fact that a scientist is able to synchronize his own trajectory of thinking and the trajectory of movement of the real and fix it with mathematical science, which allows reproducing such a trajectory in the future. It's very important. Whereas the esotericist, adjusting to the trajectory of reality and synchronizing with it, is able to reproduce it only once, which allows him to shout Eureka, but in the very next experiment, he does not get into the beat and gets disappointed. He can reproduce the trajectory twice, but it does not matter in the context of 5 sigma confidence or 99.9999%. Why can't you get into the beat? Here we will need to turn to quantum mechanics, since, as we argue, any experiment is the formation of certain boundary or boundary conditions, which in turn are determined by the walls of a certain resonator, which determines the natural frequencies of the experiment and its own cyclicity, and accordingly the behavior of the experiment. The boundary conditions of the experiment imply many factors: the material used, their shape, their environment, and placement in space. Obviously, such a resonator is always formed by the researcher. It's very important. And it is for this reason that it is impossible to exclude human influence on the experiment. The inability to accurately reproduce the initial data leads to the irreproducibility of the experiment, which is observed by esotericists. At the beginning of the 20th century, the belief in predictive science was severely undetermined by quantum mechanics. Physicists have discovered that whereas previously it was possible to accurately calculate the trajectory of an entity, now it turns out that it is just as accurately possible to determine the dynamics of the probability of detecting an entity at a given point in the trajectory. For a long time, there was a huge gap between macro physics and the microcosm, and it seemed that the laws of classical physics still applied at the macro level. But over the past 20 years, these two worlds have become significantly closer. And in many works, it has been shown that macro-realism obeys the same quantum laws. For example, there is a well-known and still poorly studied effect called Bernard cells. When a heated, dense liquid, such as chocolate, in a mug occurs an internal structure with hexagonal cells. These cells significantly depend on the shape of the circle, on the boundary condition that determine the natural frequencies for this experiment. The shape and scale of ordinary cyclones and anticyclones are also determined by the boundary condition and the intrinsic function of the atmosphere where the walls of the circle are, on the one hand, the earth, on the other hand, outer space. You can see here boundary condition, and here different level boundary conditions. Similarly, the wave function of an electron in a crystal is determined on the one hand by an atom, a small resonator, and therefore on the other hand, by a crystal, a larger resonator, and therefore is the product of the wave function corresponding to the atom and the wave function corresponding to the crystal. It is a well-known Bloch function. We can see multiply two wave function which have different level, atom and molecule. And as can be seen from the picture, there is a complex three-dimensional map of the energy levels of such an electron. The most important point for further discussion is the hypothesis that the wave function of an electron and other essence located at all energy levels, very important, including the lower ones, is the product of the wave function of the entire scale hierarchy. In other words, an electron located in an atom also senses the entire crystal, its boundaries, just as a string senses its own boundaries, rearranging itself in sound when they change. Therefore, if the boundaries of the crystal change, the frequency of the corresponding multiplier of the wave function will also change. This can be expressed by the very important formula where wave function phi equal multiplication different phi eta, where phi eta is the wave function of the corresponding scale. It follows that by the behavior of an electron, we can judge the entire hierarchy of resonators within which this electron oscillates: an atom, a molecule, a crystal, a laboratory room, up to the galaxy and above. In other words, from the behavior of an electron in the laboratory, we can extract information about the behavior of, for example, a galaxy. It would seem that this violates Einstein's postulate of the ultimate speed of light. Recall the Einstein's postulate of the ultimate velocity of matter means that it is impossible to transfer energy at a higher speed than the speed of light. But you can transfer the phase. It's very important. According to the above, any entity has a whole set of natural frequencies. You can use a metaphor and say that any entity, like an orchestra, sounds with many voices. By creating experimental conditions, the scientists adjust a part of this sound, forming the resonator of the experiment. In other words, its boundary conditions. The scientist repeatedly reproduces the experiment and either for himself or for someone else. Unlike the esotericist, whose resonata change. We can say that the esotericist resembles a master who has created a new instrument resembling a violin and expects it to play like the previous instrument. Or an esotericist can be likened to a student who picked up a violin for the first time and tried to play it. At the same time, there is always some change that the student will produce a quiet, tolerable melody. Hence the well-known rule, beginners are lucky because they are not yet limited by the trajectory of thinking and can switch to a neighboring trajectory with a different topology. As a scientist is limited by the experimental trajectories known to him, which arose in previous generations. For example, the evolution of the violin has come a very long way. Many tools of different shapes were created from different wood. Some could play harmonious music, while others were out of tune. Of course, an interesting question arises as to how to tune into this harmonious melody. Obviously, this is related to the concept of resonance. Only under this condition will the trajectory of thinking and the actual trajectory be coherent. At the same time, it is obvious that a scientist can tune into such an interaction of thinking and reality, provided that he understands the process behind the science of mathematics, just as the comma in ordinary speech slows down the process of thinking. Similarly, mathematical science affects its speed. One of the important evidence confirming our idea of the correlation of mental and real trajectories is the Jungian concept of synchronicity, which occurs in the case of a scientist on an ongoing basis, and in the case of an esotericist by change. Jung noted that accidents are not accidental, and a person can synchronize with some real cycles by strengthening thinking or conversely relaxing it, for example, in a dream. It is shown on the picture. This diagram illustrated the fractality of social processes in which each person participates: family, enterprise, city, country, humanity. Here a bold dot indicates a person through whom the trajectories of many social processes pass, indicated by circles. Naturally, social processes are also cyclical and also have their own wave function. And the whole of humanity is a crystal. In the context of our work, the much more interesting question is, how do we learn to synchronize with cosmic scale processes? Let's imagine the circulation of matter around the sun, planets, asteroids, meteorites, comets, and various dust. This is a single cyclical process, and if thinking can get in time with this process, it is possible to predict the next comet arrival without resorting to calculation, which in fact esotericists do. In the field of synchronism research, there is a central concept of modern quantum mechanics, the theory of entanglement, of connectedness, when two particles behave coherently until one of them is examined. In other words, the moment of preparation of one of the particles. At the same time, the second one is in a well-defined state at this moment. Such connectedness appears at the moment of the extreme interaction. The entanglement of the symbolic and the real must also occur in some extreme conditions, when mental activity is strained and when the system of science being built along a certain trajectory of thinking becomes coherent with reality. Then the detection of a particle in a certain state corresponds to a certain state of the theory. But in the context of what has been said, it is not even the entanglement of the real and the symbolic that is more interesting, but the fact that by examining, for example, particles from cosmic rays, we can remotely imagine another part of the galaxy and moderate it. That's all. Thank you for your attention. You can see here my article, which was published in Russian magazine.